Imagine this, a vast, unstoppable army, 600,000 strong, marching across Europe, led by one of history's greatest military geniuses. They conquer nations, redraw maps, and seem invincible. Then, in the frozen expanse of Russia, something utterly catastrophic happens. Not just a defeat, but an annihilation so complete, so baffling, that centuries later, historians still debate how it was even possible. What force, what insurmountable obstacle could erase nearly 90% of an army that had once dominated the continent? To truly grasp the horror of what transpired, we need to rewind to the glittering peak of Napoleon Bonaparte's power. It's 1812, and the French emperor stands as the undisputed master of continental Europe. From Spain to Poland, his influence was absolute. Empires trembled at his name, and his Grand Army, the Grande Armée, was a mosaic of soldiers from France, Germany, Italy, Poland, and almost every corner of his vast dominion. This wasn't merely an army, it was an entire nation on the march, numbering an astonishing 600,000 men, supported by hundreds of thousands of horses, supply wagons, and countless camp followers. Their objective? Russia. Napoleon viewed Tsar Alexander I's withdrawal from his continental blockade against Britain as a personal affront, a challenge to his supremacy that could not go unanswered. The plan was audacious, even for Napoleon. A swift, decisive campaign, a knockout blow delivered deep inside Russian territory, forcing Alexander to the negotiating table. On June 24, 1812, the massive hosts surged across the Niemen River, a living tide of humanity. Their colorful uniforms, a stark contrast to the endless green forests and vast plains of the Russian frontier. They believed they were invincible. They believed they were on the cusp of an even greater glory. But what awaited them was not glory, but a slow, agonizing descent into a hellish nightmare that would forever haunt the annals of military history. The initial advance into Russia was deceptively smooth, but within weeks, the cracks began to show. The sheer scale of the army, its greatest strength, became its most crippling weakness. Supply lines stretched endlessly, becoming vulnerable and difficult to maintain. The Russian army, under the cunning General Mikhail Kutuzov, refused to engage in a decisive battle, instead employing a brutal scorched-earth policy. As Napoleon's forces pushed deeper, they found towns burned, wells poisoned, and food supplies decimated. This wasn't just a military tactic, it was a deliberate strategy to starve and demoralize an invading army. Imagine 600,000 men marching through a desolate landscape, watching their supply convoys dwindle, their rations shrink, and their horses die by the thousands from lack of fodder. Dysentery and typhus, the silent killers of every great campaign, began to thin the ranks, claiming more lives than any skirmish. The oppressive heat of the Russian summer gave way to incessant rains, turning roads into quagmires and slowing the colossal army to a torturous crawl. By the time Napoleon finally reached the outskirts of Moscow in September, after the brutal and indecisive Battle of Borodino, where over 70,000 men fell in a single day, his army was already reduced by more than a third, not from combat, but from disease, starvation, and desertion. He entered a deserted, burning Moscow, a hollow victory, and waited for Tsar Alexander's surrender, a surrender that never came. As weeks turned into months, the Russian winter, a foe more formidable than any army, began to loom. Napoleon, trapped in a burning city with no supplies and no hope of a peace treaty, made the agonizing decision to retreat. It was late October when the Grand Army began its long, desperate march westward, abandoning the dreams of glory and facing the stark reality of survival. The initial stages of the retreat were bad enough, but as the first flurries of snow began to fall, an even more terrifying adversary emerged. The temperatures plummeted, dipping to unheard-of levels, sometimes 30 degrees Celsius. Napoleon's soldiers, many still in their summer uniforms, faced unimaginable suffering. Frostbite became rampant, turning extremities black and gangrenous. Fingers, toes, even entire limbs were lost to the biting cold. Starvation grew more severe as the remaining supplies were quickly exhausted. Horses, once the backbone of the army, froze to death in their thousands, their carcasses providing a grim, temporary source of food for the desperate soldiers. Discipline, the bedrock of any army, began to crumble. Soldiers began falling out of ranks, huddling together, muttering prayers, or simply collapsing in the snow to perish. The once proud Grande Armée, that glittering tide of humanity that had swept across Europe, was now a ragged, starving column of ghosts, relentlessly harried by Cossack cavalry and partisan attacks, retreating through a landscape that was simultaneously beautiful and deadly. Each day brought more death, more despair, more losses that seemed to defy comprehension. The nadir of this horrifying retreat, the moment where the Grand Army truly ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force, came at the Berezina River in late November. The river, relatively small in summer, was now an icy, treacherous barrier, partially frozen but not solid enough to support the weight of thousands of men, horses, and cannons. Russian armies were closing in from north and south, effectively trapping Napoleon's forces against the river. It was a death trap. With incredible ingenuity and courage, French engineers, working for days in the freezing water, constructed 2 pontoon bridges under constant enemy fire, their hands and feet freezing, many dying in the icy currents. What followed was an apocalyptic scene of chaos and sheer terror. As the remnants of the army attempted to cross, the narrow bridges became choke points of desperation. Soldiers, civilians, wounded, and supply wagons all surged forward, trampling one another in a frantic struggle for survival. The bridges groaned, snapped, and collapsed under the immense weight, sending hundreds, perhaps thousands, plunging into the frigid depths. Eyewitness accounts speak of a black, seething mass of bodies, of horrific screams echoing across the frozen landscape, of men fighting to their last breath, not against an enemy soldier, but against the crushing weight of their comrades. Those who made it across faced continuous attacks and the merciless grip of hunger and cold. Thousands more perished on the other side, often losing their minds, driven to cannibalism or simply freezing to death as they stumbled onwards. By the time Napoleon and a mere fraction of his army finally reached the safety of Polish territory in December, the Grand Army, the force of 600,000 that had set out with such grand ambition, had been reduced to a skeletal force of perhaps 30,000 to 40,000 utterly broken, frostbitten, and starving men. Most of them were too traumatized to ever fight again. The retreat from Russia was not just a military defeat. It was a profound human tragedy on an unimaginable scale. The catastrophic loss sustained by Napoleon's Grand Army in Russia remains one of history's most terrifying cautionary tales. Of the 600,000 who marched east, barely 10% returned. What became of the rest? Died in battle, yes, but far more succumbed to the elements, the bitter cold, the hunger, and the rampant diseases. Tens of thousands simply vanished, lost to the unforgiving Russian wilderness, their bones perhaps still resting beneath the thawing permafrost. The sheer scale of this annihilation begs the question: was it hubris, logistical failure, the brilliant and ruthless tactics of the Russians, or simply an unstoppable act of nature that led to such a profound disaster? Historians debate furiously, but perhaps it was a horrific confluence of all these factors. The psychological impact on Europe was immense. Napoleon, though he would rebuild an army, never fully recovered from this blow. The myth of his invincibility was shattered, and the seeds of his eventual downfall were sown in the frozen fields of Russia. The story of the Grand Army's demise serves as a chilling reminder of the fragility of even the greatest power when confronted by the combined forces of nature and a determined, desperate foe. To this day, the ghostly echoes of those 600,000 men continue to haunt the vast, silent plains of Russia.